works of Nana Asma'u. Our women, Jihad, Nana Asma'u, scholar and scribe, and educating Muslim women to the West African legacy of Nana Asma'u. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mack.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you for that introduction. I do appreciate it. And I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to get lots of people to learn how to pronounce Nana Asma'u. So that's great. Let's see if I can do this technology. I can, except that I need to turn the screen on. Okay, so the cavalry is on her way. We are talking about gender and education in Islam. And I want to begin with a little thought-provoking imagery. Because we can't talk about gender and Islam, gender and education in Islam, without talking about gender roles and perceptions on gender roles. So you see in this cartoon that it all depends on what your perspective is. The glass is either half full or half empty, depending upon what your value system is, what your tradition might have been in growing up, and what you believe the case to be at the moment. I also want to start with a little story, and you're required to chuckle after this, so I'm just giving you a heads up on this, because my students know that they don't get their extra credit unless they laugh at my lame jokes. But this is a story about Barbara Walters interviewing women in Afghanistan after the first wave of the Taliban had left. And I don't know if it's a true story or apocryphal, but the story goes that she asked one of these women, she said, you know, the Taliban are out of town now in Kabul. Why is it that you women still walk behind your men? And the woman, without skipping a beat, said, landmines. So in a nanosecond, what this story does is to shatter all your stereotypes about Muslim women being subordinate and being brainless, walking behind their men because they're just so imprisoned that they don't know what to do. Yeah, the Muslim women I know, from having lived 3 years in northern Nigeria and having spent a lot of time in other parts of West Africa and in Morocco, are women who will just knock you over. They are driven, they are motivated, they are independent. These are women who got that way because of education and because of their familiarity with Islam and what Islam was supposed to guarantee for women. There are many, many stories of Christian women who sought to save Muslim women by reading the Quran and then converting these women to Christianity, and those women usually ended up converting to Islam. When they saw what the Quran said about women's rights, women's autonomy, respect for women. So all of this that Islam brought to the world was supposed to grant equality for women, autonomy for women, respect for women. However, it's a tough task because Islam was pushing against millennia of patriarchy, and with that patriarchy very often comes misogyny. And so we, at this point in time, have endured 4,000 years of patriarchy. That's a lot to push against. And so Islam continues to try to preserve respectability and rights for women, but it's a struggle. Yes? equality is a struggle for me. Okay, here is another example of a picture being worth 1,000 words. Your brain goes from left, oh, oppressed, covered, to right, oh, covered, but that's good, to the middle, oh, naked, good, bad, and then your brain is all in a jumble. And that's the whole point of this New Yorker cover, to make you think again about values, to think about what's good, what's bad, and to realize that it all depends on the context. It depends on why you're having this discussion. This is what the Taliban fear: an educated woman bearing what they call a weapon of mass instruction. So people like the Taliban, people like Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, these are men who are not very well educated, who are advocating what they call Islam, and it really has nothing to do with what is in the Quran in terms of guaranteeing respect for both men and women. There are two foundational precepts of Islam: equality for everyone. This was the radical notion in the 7th century. How is that possible? There were a minority of very wealthy, very powerful men who owned a lot of slaves and who owned a lot of women, and at that time women and slaves, not much difference. And they had the respectability and the value of a set of chairs, to be disposed of as the men wished, to be bought and sold like commodities. So that minority of very powerful men objected severely to Islam and its radical notions that everybody was equal. Not only those men whom I have bought to work for me, but also the women, the 40 women in my household. Are you kidding me? Respectable, equal? How dare this new message try to assert that equality? But again, that's the half-empty perspective. The half-full perspective, three-quarters full perspective, was that of everybody else who came into contact with Islam and realized that indeed here was a message of equality, of mercy and compassion for everyone, that everyone was equal in the eyes of God. This was a radical and very appealing notion to those of the majority in the world at that time, in that place and time, who were disenfranchised. So this saying, seek knowledge unto China, is something that we associate with Islam and with the Prophet. This idea that not only are you allowed as an equal member of this community to seek knowledge, but guess what? The Quran requires that you seek knowledge without regard to gender or color or nationality or any other distinguishing external factor. There are books. Muhammad Nadwi has a wonderful book called Al-Muhadditat, in which he describes the stories of women who studied the Hadith. The Hadith is the word for the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, or stories about the Prophet Muhammad. And there were women who would travel all over the known world to study with scholars who knew a great deal about this. In his very short, well, it's long, but considering the sources, it's fairly short. In this book, he gives little snippets of all the women he knows of from his research. And I looked at the bibliography. There are over 200 sources in Arabic, so of course not accessible to the likes of us for the most part. And those sources, each of those sources is at least 5 to 10 volumes, and they date back as early as the 9th century, and they go up to the 19th century. So this book that he has produced about little snippets of bibliographic, biographic information about women who studied the Hadith in the history of Islam is just the tip of the iceberg. And these were just women who studied Hadith. These were not women who studied other aspects of Islam. This is just one specialized form. So do not ever let anyone tell you that women are not a part of the history of Islam, and do not ever let anyone tell you that women are not educated members of the scholarly community in Islam. And do not ever let anyone tell you that women have no right to an education, and that goes for Boko Haram, and that goes for the Taliban, and that goes for the so-called ISIS that dares to use Islam in their name. You have an obligation of seeking knowledge, even if it takes you to the end of the earth, to China. And this is borne out by the very first revelation from God to the Prophet Muhammad. And that very first revelation from God is not the first chapter of the Quran, because the Quran is not a chronological collection of the revelations. It's not in that chronology. But that revelation was chapter 96, the first 5 verses anyway, we know for sure. Ikra, read, recite. Read, recite. And this very first revelation instructed people that what they needed to do was to search for knowledge and to take up the pen. And that goes for women as well. So here we have images from the Encyclopedia of Women in Islam. And what you see here is women with a book, women in hijab, women not in hijab, women laughing, women enjoying life. These are images that we don't see in the headlines. Why? Because mass market media like to sell newspapers. And the way to sell newspapers is not so much to be about the truth as to cater to the stereotypes that people have, especially concerning a charged issue like Islam. So what I'm going to do for you today is talk about some case studies from this region of the world. Now, when we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, that's one discussion. For the purposes of this discussion, to talk about gender and education in Islam, we really need to consider the entire continent. And I teach in a Department of African and African American Studies, and whenever someone raises the issue of North Africa, Islamic Africa, and implies that that should not be a part of what we study in our department, we counter with, gee, the last time we checked, North Africa was still attached to the continent. And so guess what? You can call it Middle East if you want, but Egypt still belongs in Africa. There are reasons to talk about the Middle East and include North Africa, and there are reasons to separate that from Sub-Saharan Africa geographically, and if you're talking about ethnic groups and all of that. But for the purposes of a discussion about Islam, we need to talk about North Africa as well. So, first of all, here's an image of Fatima Harak. Now, by some mysterious technological capability that's beyond me, the first time years ago that I downloaded this slide, it kind of went through lots of different images. And so when I see my PowerPoint at home, it's still. And then every time I get in front of a crowd of people, it starts doing its dance. So that will not be on the quiz, and you don't need to put that in response to the prompt. But I'm just saying, there are many mysteries in life. Fatima Harak is an historian and political scientist. She has an MA from Paris, and she has a BA from a small college in Iowa. And then she has MAs and PhDs from Paris, from London. That should tell you a lot right away about how multilingual she is. She speaks American. She speaks French, and of course, she's fluent in Arabic as well. She was raised in Morocco. She's one of 7 in her family, 6 of whom are girls, and they all have college educations and are professional. She grew up in a rural area, so this is not an anomaly of an urban upbringing. She taught at the University of Kansas for a little while. She has been director of the African Studies program at Mohammed VI University in Rabat. Here are 3 university professors. Fatima Siddiqui on the left is at the University of Fez. She's retired now. She started a school for Arabic language in Medina in Fez. On the right, we have Khadija Bajnani at VMI. She teaches all these military guys Arabic. It's quite interesting. And that's the Virginia Military Institute. And in the middle, we have me looking more Moroccan than the 2 Moroccan women who are with me. So we met up at some point in July of '07 and have this picture. They were there for their research, I was there for my research, and we all dressed accordingly. There are women on their way to work and school in Rabat, Morocco. The reason that I like this slide is that it shows you images of women in various modes of attire. Not everybody wears a hijab, and not everybody wears a long jalaba. A lot of Moroccan women dress exactly the way that I'm dressed right now. And they are on their way to school, on their way to work, whatever. There are a lot of women involved in higher education, a lot of women who are teachers. And so women are very integral to education in their communities. Like this woman, who is a primary school teacher in Meknes in Morocco. I was in Meknes in the old city of Medina, walking down the street, and I heard chanting. And I looked around, there was nobody in the street, and I saw some steps. So I went up the steps, and there on the 2nd level was this primary school class. And obviously she was having them learn the alphabet, and the way you do in any primary school class. And I kind of, like, excuse me, and she said, oh, come in, and she had the kids say, good morning, and there she is, teaching her primary school class. And the reason that I tell you all of this is that very often in my travels in Morocco, especially, I would walk by a school and see at the 1st level classes of young boys learning their lessons. And had I not been searching for women in classes, I would not have realized that wherever you see these classes of young boys, there are classes of young girls too, but they won't be on the main level where you can peek into the window. They'll be on the 2nd level for privacy's sake. So the point is, just because you don't see something like a class full of women doesn't mean that it's not there. It may be that they are somewhere else that is a more comfortable venue for them, where they don't need to worry about being accessible to the public. Now, here's the work of another woman from Morocco. Lala Es-Saidi is a Moroccan artist, and this is a poster from her exhibit in 2010. What she does is to take Orientalist images and inscribe them with calligraphy, very often verses of the Quran, which may sound sacrilegious to you. Another woman who does this, an artist, is Shirin Nashat, who's an Iranian, and she is persona non grata in Iran because of her chutzpah, I guess, in doing this. She is critical patriarchy in her country, as is this woman critical of colonial oppression, because, you know, the colonial period in Africa was roughly 1900 to 1960. And the colonists did not do any favors to Muslim people because they perpetuated their own particular French or British or German attitudes about patriarchy. And so they said, oh, and the women, well, the women won't be educated. But we'll make schools for boys. And they did this in northern Nigeria, they did this in Morocco. And lo and behold, not only did they make schools just for boys and not for girls, but in the colonial language too. Oh, it doesn't matter that they always speak Hausa in northern Nigeria. We'll just have them study in English. They need to learn English. Or in France, oh yeah, it'll be in French because, you know, we're bringing French culture to them, so everybody has to learn French. So now, this contemporary artist obviously is an educated woman who has specialized in artistry that is actionable work. It is social activism. And this is how she makes her statements. So women are not only educated, but they are out there being social activists, making political statements, and combining artistry with those political statements. Here's another. Of course, in these images, I know that if these images were cleaner, you could read the Arabic, right? So there are a couple of things here. You know, you need a clear image, and you also need fluency in Arabic, just saying. But in the captions, when she has an exhibit, she will explain what's going on in these. All right, we're moving to Kano, Nigeria. This is the main gate of the Kano Palace. When I lived in Kano, which is in the central northern part of Nigeria, a tiny little village of maybe 3 or 4 million people, just saying, right? Old. It is one of the termini of the Trans-Saharan trade routes between Tripoli and Tunis. Tripoli, Tunis, down to Kano, and then to the coast from there. So a lot of goods, some of which were slaves, were transported across the desert. The point is, Kano has been a thriving metropolis for over 500 years. It was traditionally, until recently, has been a walled city, a fortress city, able to withstand a siege of many, many months. The walls around Kano, Nigeria, when the British arrived and stormed the wooden gates in 1903 with their cannons, the walls around the city were 25 feet wide and 50 feet tall, which meant that when the British got there, they could take the car they had brought with them and drive it around the perimeter of the walls. So it was a very secure fortress city of the type that one often sees in West Africa, one often saw in West Africa, and it had been a center of Islam for many of those centuries, having first encountered Muslims who, as you heard in Professor Searcy's lecture, were holy men, tradespeople, merchants. We had a lot of people traveling across the Sahara Desert for the purpose of selling things, but those people were themselves Muslim, who spoke Arabic, who practiced Islam. And so what they brought to Sub-Saharan Africa was not just goods, commodities, but also knowledge about Islam and knowledge about literacy as it related to Islam. So going back to that very first revelation, Ikra, recite, in the name of your God, who created you from a clot of blood, who taught you the use of the pen, who taught you what you did not know. These lines are the first revelation that the world got about Islam. And what's it about? It's all about it's all about literacy. It's all about everyone learning to read and recite and write and respect that they have life and know that they need to use their God-given talents. So, here in the Kano Palace, this is the first gate. There's a big courtyard. There's a second gate. There's another big courtyard. And there's another gate to the center of the palace. So the first thing is, traditionally, this is how the place is arranged. You can't sneak in. Believe me, I tried. There were many times when I wanted to sneak in and surprise my friend Haji Abba, one of the emir's wives, in the harem. And I managed to do it one time when I wore my wrapper really, really low so they couldn't see my white ankles. And I wore my veil really over my face the way women do when they're in mourning or something. So you pull it so that you really have the privacy of the veil around you. And I kind of put my hands under it. And I managed once to sneak in, but there, and surprise her. But normally you can't do that because there are guards kind of just casually sitting around appearing to do nothing. But they're watching and they know who goes in and who goes out. And I had permission. I spent a lot of time in the harem and that was fine. There are also peacocks. You know, peacocks are pretty, but they're also guardians. So they fly up to the top of the wall and make this horrible sound. If anybody they don't recognize is coming along. So they're really good guard dogs. So here's the palace. And you get to the third gate, to the inside of the palace. And that is where you see a primary school. So during the days when I sat in the harem to talk to Haji Abba, and I saw people come and go, and I did my little participant observation, just kind of hanging around. Once I tried to cook for them in compensation for all the food they gave me, and it was so bad that these very dignified women took a bite and then rolled on the floor laughing and spit it out. And they said to me in House of Binta, please, we beg you, do your research, but don't cook for us. We'll cook for you. Yeah, I made navy beans, right? If you don't soak them long enough, they're like that. They said this is like eating gravel from the road, but thanks for the thought. So my point here is I would hang around a lot and eat their food and listen to their conversations. They were very kind and generous. And I saw the children come and go. Speaking of education, which we're doing, right? In the morning, the kids would put on their little blue uniforms about the color of your shirt, their little blue, dresses or their pants, their shirts, and they would go off, starting from age 5. And they would go for the morning to the local primary school within the palace, because this was a school for the community. And there were schools all through this very large town. Then they'd come home for lunch, they'd go and change their clothes, they'd have lunch, then they'd go off to the Quranic school for the afternoon, where the children started by learning at age 5 in the same way that kids age 5 learn here. The Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, they have the same length and import of the Lord's Prayer. And of course, you would hear them chanting, Bismillahi ar-Rahmani ar-Rahim. Now, and so when people go through, tourist groups or something go through, they say, oh yeah, we heard those Muslim kids, and all they do is memorize stuff and they don't know what it means. Well, yeah, when you're 5, you don't have a real intellectual grasp of the theology behind anything. And this is how they learn. This is how they start to learn Arabic. They memorize the Fatiha first, then they have memorized it, so they learn to write it. But to learn to write it, you have to learn the alphabet. And so this is where the learning begins. And yes, there is a lot of chanting. That's how it starts. And then as you get older, your mind develops and you're able to have a more intellectual engagement with the material, then you learn other ways. Incidentally, see on people's doors all through Sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria, Morocco, everywhere. Ghana. This is a very special color blue associated with spirituality and protection. And there have been written many very interesting books on the color blue and its importance. The other color that's really important to Islam is green, because green is the color associated with paradise, with the Prophet, especially in Sufism, also white, so white, green, and blue. And incidentally, these are colors that you will see on the Nigerian flag. Okay, so here's that third entrance where people see, the guy's just kind of casually sitting down. So it's not like he has to stamp your hand so that you can get in or anything, but he knows who's allowed in and who's not. And this is an image of the courtyard in the harem, at the heart of the Emir's palace in Kano. So now you can say that you have been to the harem in the Kano palace. Off the courtyard are entrances to sets of apartments, one in each corner of the palace, because the Kano Emir has 4 wives, political alliances. This is not always his wish. This is the Emir who was sitting when I was there. He's just recently died. And he said to me, you do what you have to do. And it's kind of awkward, actually. But just as Lady Di or the prince himself could not marry anybody but had to get someone like Diana, who had a history but not a past, I think is what they said of her. When you are royalty, you have obligations to your public, and you need to do certain things. Now, the men at the university where I taught, down the road from Kano, the men at the university would say to me, every single educated man would say to me, well, yeah, 4 wives are allowed, but as it says in the Quran, if you must, then take 2 or 3 or 4, but only if you can treat them equally. And they said, and you know what that means. I can barely handle 1. How could I possibly handle more than this? So this idea of having 4 wives is something that you will hear from people who are not educated. This is what I heard from a man in town when I was interviewing poets. And he said, I must have 4 wives, my religion requires it. But then when he said to me that I would burn in hell because I was not married, at the time I was not, and I said to him, please bring the Quran and show me where it says that. He was so upset that I really thought he was going to do something violent. And then he stomped off, and his wife said to me, maybe we should meet at your place from now on. And she said, and I didn't realize this, she said, he's upset because he's not able to read the Quran. So he was not literate, and she was. And this caused a lot of conflict in the household because he wanted to rule and he didn't understand what she knew from having read the Quran about her rights as a Muslim woman. Indeed, Haji Abba, my friend, the royal wife, constantly said, she herself had a teacher training certificate, as did another one of the wives, and she constantly said, women here have to learn to read so they will know their rights. Otherwise, you get men who are not educated telling them anything they want to tell them, and women don't have any response or any way of protecting themselves. So my point here is, literacy is really important among the Muslims I know and the people I hung out with during field research, because It is a means of knowing what God says your rights and obligations are. Your right is to an education. Your obligation is to amass knowledge. This is a corner of the Harim, just so you can see a little more. And this is the late Emir of Kano Adebayo's third wife, Hagia Hafsatu, in her apartments. This is the woman who kept saying, women need to learn to read so they will know their rights. These are her daughters, two of her daughters. And this one was born when I was there. I used to carry her on my back, and this one was like 5 years old. This one is now one of the wives of the current Emir of Kano, who used to be the head of Central Bank, Lamido Sanusi. And he does have another wife who is a veterinarian, and that's another discussion. Here we are in her apartment in 1979. So, you know, looking very traditional, but very, very progressive in terms of her attitudes about education. Fluent in Hausa, fluent in Fulfulde, fluent in Arabic, accomplished, and she made sure that, whoops, can I go back? Thank you. Mariam, you brought this. Thank you. Previous. Okay, there we go. Wow. That's big time for me to be able to do that. These two women were graduate students at the time when I saw them in 2001. I forgot what the one on the left was studying, but I believe it was this one was studying history. Now, we talked about the colonial era, and many people refer to this as the colonial error, E-R-R-O-R, saying, right? That won't be on the quiz either. But Hagia Medaki was a wife of the Katsina Emir. And the reason her picture is here is that I interviewed her extensively while I lived there. And there's an article in Pavlina's Life Histories of African Women that I wrote about her. And her claim to fame is that, at least for me, is that although she was not educated, that is, she was not literate, having grown up in a traditional atmosphere prior to colonialism and then with the onset of colonialism, she was very progressive in terms of women's education. She went to her husband, the Emir, who had talks with the colonial officers in Katsina, and they had discussed setting up a boys' school. And she went to her husband, the Emir, and she said, where's our girls' school? Why are we not getting a girls' school? Why are only the boys getting a school? And she badgered him and badgered him until he set up a girls' school. And he said, okay, you're going to be the matron of the school and kind of oversee that everybody's where they're supposed to be. So she was the one organizing. That is what we mean by the matron of the girls' school. She was the one who kept everything in order. And so here is an example of a woman who, despite, or maybe because of not having an education herself, made sure that a lot of these girls in Katsina had the opportunity to learn to read and write. And they were not just learning to read the Quran. They had a whole curriculum, and this was the case in Kano too. From primary school on, they learned math, they learned history, they learned geography, they learned entrepreneurial skills and childcare. Religious education was one of their courses. So it wasn't as though they were being indoctrinated like the little Taliban kids in Afghanistan who are made to memorize one verse of the Quran out of context, which, by the way, the Quran instructs you, you may not do. You must take the whole message and understand the spirit of the whole message entirely. It says in the Quran, you may not cite chapter and verse for your own agenda. And if you want me to, I can cite the chapter and verse that says you may not cite the chapter and verse. So she was instrumental in the establishment of a girls' school in Katsina. Now here's a picture of a typical family in northern Nigeria. Girls and boys both attend these Quranic and Western schools. So they spend half their day at one, half their day at the other. They start maybe at 5, maybe at 4. They start very early, and education is the most important job that they do. So what I saw is a very serious commitment to education on the part of the government, on the part of religious authorities. And that commitment to education was equally important for girls as for boys. Now, having said that, I know what you're thinking. Yes, it is the case that there is still a great patriarchal structure to society. And yes, it does not mean that girls can just go and do everything they want. But guess what? That's not the case here either, although we live by that mythology. There are a lot of social pressures to marry, to have children, and all of that. But girls who are educated, who can read the Quran, know that in the Quran it says you must pursue knowledge, even unto China. All people are equal. The Quranic voice of God addresses, oh you female believers, oh you male believers, all the time throughout the Quran. Nevertheless, there is peer pressure, there is social pressure, and those who are not as well versed with the Quran, not as able to read the Quran, don't know that they have these rights as women. And even women who know they have these rights still have to live in the culture where they are. They have to live in the family they grow up in. They have to deal with marriages. And they have to deal with a society that continues to let patriarchy override Quranic ideals. That's just the way the world is. It's the way the world is here. It's the way the world is there. Here is one of my dear friends, Bilkisu Yusuf, a journalist. She got her MA in political science at Wisconsin. It happened this way. I had been in Kano for 1.5 years doing research. I was back in Madison, Wisconsin to write my dissertation. I was sitting outside a class on Islam, waiting to go into class because guess what? I had never taken a class on Islam before I went to Nigeria. Who let me get away with that? I don't know, not a good idea. But it was actually a very good idea because I learned Islam from the women in Kano. So this woman, in all her attire, comes along, sits down in the hallway next to me, and I say, excuse me, where are you from? She said, Africa. I said, well, yes, I know, but where? West Africa. I said, well, I kind of figured that, but where? She said, Nigeria. I said, well, yeah, I thought so, but where? She said, the north. I said, yeah, I kind of figured that was the case too, but where? And she looked at me. And then I said to her in Hausa, oh, I lived at this particular address in Kano, and she went, and we were neighbors. And so it was very interesting, and this is how I got to know Bilkisu, and she was doing her MA in political science. And I thought, wow, this is great. I've studied about women and education and literacy, and here is a prime example. So we were having lunch one day, and I said to her one of my many dumb questions, many in my lifetime. That's how you learn. I said, oh, this is so amazing. Your husband, who is a lawyer, your husband must be so progressive to have you come here all the way across the world alone to pursue your master's degree. And by way of response, she gave me one of these. which meant that's a dumb question. And then she looked at me and said, you took a second wife when I left. So there is an example of two very well-educated individuals and patriarchy in full swing. Because of course, he needed another wife there to, take care of the children, take care of the house, do the dishes, blah, blah, blah. So the plot thickens because then when I finished my dissertation, I went back to Nigeria, and so did Bilkisu. And guess what? I was teaching at the university, Bayero University in Kano. And guess who I had as a student in one of my classes? Yeah, his second wife. Awkward. And so Bilkisu divorced him. But she was a journalist. She wrote for a local newspaper. She wrote for a lot, and still writes for a lot of different newspapers, and was a delegate to the UN. And here she is at a conference, as I say, to the left of Laura Bush. But then who isn't? Right, here's another example of a woman from Nigeria, Aisha, who was a contemporary of Bilkisu Yusuf. Her mother was Asian, her father was Nigerian. She is a theorist, a teacher, an activist, and if any of you, you're probably too young to remember, but some of the older folks in the audience remember that Time magazine had a cover story about a stoning, an adultery stoning issue in northern Nigeria several years ago, maybe a decade ago, which was a total smokescreen because it was not a story that should have come to the news. The judge who ordered a stoning of a divorced woman who found herself pregnant and then was accused of adultery was a man who did not know the law, did not know that Maliki law provides for protection of a pregnant woman and her fetus, and her child when it's born for up to 2 years, even when the husband and wife are divorced. And the idea is that the law provides some security for a woman. I mean, people know that the gestation period is not 2 years. We are not elephants, but the Western press picked this up and said, oh, adultery, stoning, northern Nigeria, and it was a big deal. And so when the case was dismissed, it was not a cover story for Time magazine. No retraction, we didn't hear anything more about it. The reason I'm telling you this is that she was instrumental in getting that case thrown out of court because she is a legal activist. Now, we're moving to some examples of women who are maybe not in the news and not in the West. These are examples of maybe exceptional, ordinary people in the population. This primary school teacher and published, it should be published ED, poet. That's the flaw in the carpet, so that I'm not aiming for perfection. However, we'll hear more about her in the next lecture, but she's an example of, she's the one who had the husband who was not literate, and so it was a very difficult match. She was a secondary school teacher and a poet. This woman also was, the other one was a primary school teacher, and this one also was a primary school teacher and a published poet. And their works are in the works that I have published. Now, this woman was interesting because you can tell by her title, Hajjia, that she has gone on Hajj to Makkah. Not only did she go on Hajj, but she used to regularly go as a guide and translator. She spoke Arabic, she spoke Fulbright, she spoke Hausa, she spoke French, she spoke English. So she would translate for people on the Hajj. And then she stopped teaching school, she divorced her husband, she started to work for Nigerian Airways as the head of the ground crew. So she would disappear behind a wall when I met her at the airport with a question and say, I'll be right out. And she'd change into her uniform, which was this color, and she had a little, polyester outfit with her cap, and she'd come out and say, now, before I get to work, what are your questions? And then when she retired from that, she couldn't sit still, so she established a concrete block business and hired 2 men to make concrete blocks for the building industry in her backyard. And all the time she was amassing money so that she could build a mosque for her home village, a house for her family, and she was very independent. When I asked her, oh, you're divorced, are you going to marry again? She looked at me and said, you know, after the requisite, then she said, why? So here was a woman who was educated, independent. She had her driver, so she didn't have to bother with the traffic to take her away. And she was upper middle class, yeah, but you know, not terribly wealthy, fiercely independent. And it was because she was educated, she knew she had the right to do what she wanted to do. Here's an image of a family located in Kano, Nigeria. The children were educated locally and at university in London. And here is mother and daughter. There are mother and daughter. Just saying, you know, you're not looking terribly oppressed or covered or afraid of anything. They're independent. Here's the palace of the Sultan of Sokoto.
Can you use your microphone a little bit better because there's students walking out and it's a little hard to hear in the back.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? All right. This is the palace of the Sultan of Sokoto in Nigeria. And there is the late Sultan Machido with a cadre of university officials, chancellors, professors from the Usman Fodiyo University. So when I visited in 2001, the aim was to talk with all of these people and to make linkages with the University of Kansas. And education was very much at the center. Someone should notice that the only woman in that crowd is this white woman right here, and not a lot of women at high levels of authority at the university. Nevertheless, I did meet with a lot of university women here who drove me around in their cars and said, you know what, as long as I'm on official business, as long as I'm pursuing knowledge, I can go, you know, I would say, is this okay for you to go here? I can go anywhere I want. I'm legit, you know, it's all about education. It's fun. So this is the current Sultan of Sokoto, Saadu Abu Bakr. He was invited to give a keynote address at Harvard Divinity School in 2011. And he said, yeah, that's fine, I will do that, but only if you will include in your agenda, in the itinerary, a panel discussion about Nana Asma'u, who is a 19th century scholar and poet, and his great-great-great-great-grandmother. More about her in a moment. These are students at the Sokoto School of Nursing in 2001. You'll notice there are girls on one side of the classroom, boys on the other side of the classroom. As is the case in many of the mosques I've visited, where you know the women are not locked away, but they're one side of the room and men are on the other side of the room. You'll notice there are different types of head ties and coverings. The men are in their shirts and ties. And some of the women who attended some of my lectures at the University of Sokoto when I visited were these women. And I took this picture because I wanted you to see the great diversity of women. There's another mistake. Broadcasters, journalists, teachers, students. These women had all different aims in life and different professions in life, but they were out there and they were vocal and they were learning and they were disseminating knowledge. This is an image of what we think Nana Asma'u might have looked like. It was, her dates are 1793 to 1864, so we don't have a photograph, but this is a descendant of hers, a flying woman in northern Nigeria. Her claim to fame is that she established what is called the Young Taru, the associates, women teachers of other women. It was a model of women's education that persists to this day unbroken in northern Nigeria. And we also have our local chapters of Young Taru, Muslim women who are affiliated with the Fodiyo family of scholars in northern Nigeria who live in this country and who follow this model of women's education, of other women. The first book listed there, the collected works of Nana Asma'u, is this one that I did with a colleague. And my point in showing this to you is to show you that at the back we have the facsimiles of all her 64 poetic works in the original. This Ajami, this Arabic script, is in 3 different languages, in Fulfulde, in Hausa, and in Arabic. And then what we did was to translate them into English and give historical data for them. So when the men in northern Nigeria first knew, like when I first arrived for field work, I said, oh, I've come to study women poets. And one man at the university said to me, oh, well, there aren't any. Okay, and so this shows you how there aren't any. This is just one example of how there aren't any. This is an example of her work, but so verily, more on this in the next lecture for literature. And here's another book, Nana Asma'u, Scholar and Scribe, that talks about her works, and this is the 3rd book, Educating Muslim Women, that talks about the perpetuation of her model of women's education into the present time. Here are some pictures of American Yantaru here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And here are American Yantaru in Hartford, Connecticut. Here is a Cape Town masjid. And the reason I've got this here is that you need to remember there are Muslims everywhere on the continent in Africa. In Cape Town, we saw little boys studying. And again, here's an example of the fact that where there are little boys studying, there are likely to be little girls studying, just not out in public like that for tourists who are passing by. Here are women reading their rights, reading the Quran and knowing their rights. And here's a quote from someone in a book that I use in class. She says, Islam is a thinking Sheikh's religion. Education is more than just a privilege in Islam. It is a demand. And this image is from a book called I Cover, which you can Google and find online, I Cover, with images of women doing all kinds of things in various modes of hijab, driving trucks, surfing, being doctors, being nurses, and being superheroes too. Islam considers that the mind, the brain, and the reason of human beings is the most important gift bestowed upon them by Allah. The brain or the mind was given to the peoples of the earth in order that they might use it to gain knowledge about life and the earth and people and science and Allah. Knowledge is the highest form of worship for a Muslim believer. This is Nawal El-Sadawi, a woman who has, we will hear more about her in the next lecture. She has, she's a surgeon as well as an author of fiction and nonfiction, a political activist. She's been jailed by Nasser, she's been jailed by Sadat. She has been persona non grata, she's had death threats, she has lectured at Duke University, and she continues to be active in her white pigtails, as you will see. Here is an image of Malala. You know about Malala, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. What terrifies religious extremists like the Taliban are not American tanks or bombs or bullets. It's a girl with a book. Because that's pushback against the repressive attitude of patriarchy. A light of knowledge against fundamentalism. So, questions? What questions do you have? Questions? Yes, yes sir.
Can you clarify what the answer?
I can't hear you.
Can you clarify what